everybody. My name is Pieter Kasselmann, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cross-device flows and specifically some of the potential risks or pitfalls that we see with them. And really, this is a conversation that is really the start of a conversation. So this is so I'll talk a little bit. Daniel is going to prove that it's real by giving us a demo of how some of these threats may materialize. But the purpose really today is to get some wisdom from the crowd, right? And start the conversation to see what we can do to make these cross-device flows a little bit safer. So really, I think with that mindset, really the beginning of this conversation, not necessarily trying to present a specific solution. And both Daniel and I are very keen to hear from folks on this call as well. So I think first of all, what we'll talk about today. So we'll talk a little bit about cross-device flows as an attack vector. Daniel will give us a demo, and then we'll open it to the floor and I think get some feedback from folks here and thoughts. So when we say cross-device flow, what do we really mean? So it's really any of these flows where you end up with, say, a consumption device, and typically you end up getting a display code from an authorization server. This then gets displayed to an authorization device. The user then authorize or authenticate the transaction, and at which point the device can retrieve tokens. And so this basically, in a nutshell, right? It's any flow where you initiate the session on one device, but you end up authorizing on a second device that isn't the same as the one on which you started. The benefit from this is that you can authorize devices, you can do authorization for devices with limited input capabilities, and also you can use your second device, your mobile phone, typically for strong authentication with a personally trusted device. So very attractive in terms of the benefits and the simplicity for it. And also increasingly, I think we see that consumers, users like to use their phones. They use their phones to pay for things. They use their phones to scan QR codes in all sorts of places. So it's a sort of a ceremony that people are getting used to, is using your phone for these types of activities. However, when we look at this, or when we sort of look at what's happening with some of these flows, some of which have been standardized, like device code flow, there is this issue about the gap, right? So the interesting thing about these flows is, although I have a trusted device, the device that I am using or that I'm initiating on may not be a trusted device. It could be a kiosk, it could be a smart TV, it could be a device that I've never used before. Or even just something, a device or a QR code put up at a bus stop, right? So you can scan these codes, you can initiate these transactions, and it's not always clear that your expectations about what happens next might not be set, or the source of that consumption device isn't necessarily something that the user can figure out, right? And so what happens is we have the session transfer, and there's no real protocol to establish trust between the consumption device and the authorization device. We don't have the benefit like we might have with FIDO of physical hardware that may be connected. There isn't necessarily, especially with something like device code flow or even with SIOP, there isn't necessarily that concept of a handshake between these two devices when the session gets handed off. And so really what we're doing today is we're really pushing responsibility to make that trust decision to the user, right? And that is we can talk a little bit more about that, but that is actually, in my view, a source of concern because we end up asking users to make decisions about things that they may not necessarily understand or be familiar with. So how does the attacks work with these flows? So if we have an attacker, the attacker may control the device. They may, and essentially what they need to do is they need to be able to obtain one of these codes, and then they initiate what I think we broadly would call a social engineering or phishing style attack, where that code or that authorization code, the context gets changed. It gets put into an email or a message, or you can put it up on a billboard, right? You can put it in any other place that you like. And essentially you can say, well, you trick the user, right? It's classical phishing attacks. Please authenticate to ensure that your SharePoint files are synchronized, right? As could be one example, and there are many things like that that would make people want end users can be enticed into disclosing this. The user then ends up scanning this code or clicking on the link or entering the code, and of course they authenticate and authorize, and in the end the attacker ends up retrieving these tokens. So sort of in summary, right, the attacker can initiate the session, they can retrieve this code, they use social engineering, and then and there's a couple of these protocols that have air gaps, right? Device code flow, or the SIOP is another one, the Self Issued OpenID Provider, and maybe even CIBA, right? We should certainly look at all of these. And today, we do rely on the end user to be able to tell the difference. And we expect quite a lot from these users, right? I think of them as, I call them homo securitas, right? They are security experts, they understand the protocol, they know what to expect, they can detect social engineering and phishing attacks because they've been trained to do that. And in some ways, they're a perfect mitigation for these cross-device flows. And so when they get presented with this, they will deny, right? They would say, no, I'm not authorizing this transaction. I didn't initiate it, or that is a strange request. I should not be authenticating just because I scanned something at a bus stop. But this is a rare species, right? In reality, we're dealing with Homo sapiens. Their expertise elsewhere, right? They're not security experts. They're busy. They're in a rush. They want to get things done. Very often, they worry about breaking things, right? Unfortunately, with cookie consent now, we've sort of also been training people that if you want the website to work, you have to click yes, right? And similarly, if you get an authentication or an authorization request, you have to complete it because otherwise something might break. And they often want to help, right? I think people are often very helpful. And the question is, right, when they get presented with this, they're very likely, or some number of them, is very likely to end up saying approve, right? And so the question becomes, how can we help them to either make better decisions, or is there even ways to avoid making any decisions at all? And so before we sort of get into that, in case you're sort of thinking, well, this could not possibly be real or happening, I'm going to let Daniel. Daniel, do you want me to stop sharing so that you can do the demo on your side?
That would be great.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then Daniel will give a demo, and then we can open up for discussion.
Okay. So do you see my screen?
I do.
Excellent. So what we have here is a demo that Fabian Haug created. He's also on the call. Hi, Fabian, and thanks for setting up this demo. This comes out of our work where we are implementing the SIOP standard to use OpenID Connect with verifiable credentials. But essentially, we don't need to look at these details for the problem at hand. What is important here is that on the left side, in the red window, we have any relying party. So this could be a terminal, as Pieter said, at the bus stop, but this could also be on your desktop PC right now, and you want to log in at that website. And on the right-hand side, we have what could be your OP application. So in this case, it's an identity wallet application. But again, the details of that don't really matter so much. What is important is that you use whatever's on the right side here, that would obviously be a separate device. You use that to authenticate yourself at the relying party. So let me play the video, and then you will see what happens. So first, the user here in this case unlocks their wallet, and then uses that to scan the QR code. You can see this QR code on the screen, also on the device, scanning the red website we're trying to log in. Okay, and the user is now doing that, and we see the proof was successfully sent. Normally, on the left side here in the red window, there would be a confirmation message saying, you're authenticated, we know who you are because you presented some credentials, or you OP'd it. So yeah, really the identity data arrived at the relying party. Now, the problem is, in this case, the attack already happened. Because if you look at the full picture, and normally, of course, you don't see the full picture in an attack, but here we see the full picture. On the very left side, we have this blue window, and that is the actual relying party. The red window, of course, was all the time controlled by the attacker. Now, the user doesn't see that blue window. The user just sees the red window provided by the attacker. And now let's play the video again. So the user unlocks their wallet and uses their device to scan the QR code. And of course, they are scanning the QR code in the red window because that's all they see. But what really happened in the background is that the user authenticated at the relying party, which is in the blue window. But that blue browser is controlled by the attacker. So that was under the control of the attacker all the time, not visible to the user. And there was no indication to the user that the user is not logging in at the red window, so at attacker.example.com, but instead at the Nextcloud in the blue window. I hope this demonstrates the attack sufficiently. If not, please let me know. We can talk about that a little bit more if you like.
Thanks, Daniel. So let me see if I can share again. We're good. So the question for the audience, two questions. One, is this something that is a concern, right? Or, and then if it is, I want to I'm going to start off with a fairly open-ended question. What should we be doing about it? And what kind of options do we have here? And I think I'm sort of inviting everybody here maybe to share some thoughts, because there are, of course, many things that we could do, but I'm curious to sort of just hear from folks here and see if there are any good ideas or any solutions that we already have that we can start looking at and thinking about. So, anybody worried about this?
Justin's worried.
Well,
yes, I'm worried. But also, so there's something that we've put into the GNAP core for dealing with these type of cross-device or multi-device flows, and that's the ability to push for the AS to push a message to the device upon completion. So the user goes and types their code, and then the AS pushes down to the client side to say like, oh, it's done, and then it's effectively the equivalent of the authorization code gets passed in that channel. It's got different security properties than sort of the normal redirect post interaction type of stuff. And it's something that, to my knowledge, has not been formally modeled yet. But this is something that I'd like to see more like formal research into it to see like, does this actually stop some of these attacks, or at least make them harder to pull off, or is this something that, like, you know, it's extra steps that's not adding anything here? I'm honestly not sure what the answer is.
So that's really interesting, I think, because we have something similar in SIOP.
Right. Yeah. And there's something similar in CIBA also. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Post response in SIOP.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that doesn't help here. So I'm not sure if it helps in GNAP.
Right.
Because it just sends the data to the right relying party, which would complete the login then. What's missing is the binding to the session of the user's browser that you normally have in the authorization response in OAuth.
Right, but the assumption is that there is no binding between the two different sessions, because the user's not even necessarily starting in a session in a browser when that message comes back. So yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Justin. I'm curious, anybody else?
So Damien, you wrote that a second factor would help solve this. That came up during the discussions a couple of times already. And there are different ways to use that in the flow. Do you have a concrete protocol in mind, or how that would be used?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's just that we could bind the browser from the session, which is where the real data is, to the user logging in. So if I'm doing this phishing attack, the attacker will not have the browser session from the user. So it will only work in the browser, it will not work on a device, but you'll have to have a second, you'll have to have your session attached to the browser where the data is actually being used. So it would help solve the fact that even if the attacker gets the first code of the access, it will not get the access to the second session, because I'd have to log in with the FIDO in the real session, and then I have the origin protection with the WebAuthn then. So it would have to be the same browser session as well, because then it's more than just something that I know, it's something that I also have in the browser session. So that.
But that would mean that on a cross-device scenario, you would need to present, or you would use the same FIDO authenticator on both devices, right?
No, you don't have to, but you could. But the main thing is that you use the FIDO device that you own on the session where the data is.
You mean instead of the whole OpenID Connect flow?
As well, it's like the second factor. I wouldn't only use it, because people will want to, with self-sovereign identity, people are going to want to use the self-sovereign identity credentials to log in. And then you need an extra way of protecting it. And there's two ways you could do this. There's another way you could use a PKE solution as well, a PKI solution, but FIDO too, but you have to attach something else to the session where the data is, not the device using to log in. But you can sell the agent data as well, would help a little bit, but you want to actually attach the session in the browser where you're going to access the website, whatever it is, to you. So you need a second factor on the where the data is, not on the authorization device.
Right. So pre-authentication, so to say, with the relying party.
Yeah, it's a mix.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's the same solution. People came up with the PKI solutions as well. It works roughly the same way. Because you need to attach, it's not enough of its own. This alone will never be enough. You'll always be open to phishing for this, no matter how you try to solve it. You can use a PIN to reduce the email attacks, but you're still open to the good phishing attacks where you just present it. That's really easy to demo. If you can put that code on a video camera anywhere else, someone else can log into your session, you're open to phishing then.
Absolutely, that's the problem. Yeah,
and it's really easy to do. So
yeah, absolutely.
This alone will never be solvable. This kills for me pretty much authentication and SSE. On SSE authentication alone with cross device will never work as long as you're using presenting code to the browser. Now, if you're using DCOM v2, where there's no browser involved, you're not open to this phishing attack. But the typical flow everyone is doing is present the QR code. You log in then using your phone or whatever you're using, your wallet, and then you open the phishing. Now, if the wallet was on the same browser session as where you're logging in, you won't be open to that attack as much.
Yeah, absolutely. That would then be similar to classic OAuth automatic connect flows.
So this type of kills every authentication flow with SSE, for example. This alone, you'll never do a proper authentication.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why we're here today. So what we want to discuss about and find out whether there aren't any other solutions. I mean, we have a completely open problem space somewhere from hardware to, I don't know, using completely different protocols. But yeah, that's what we're doing to explore today.
It's you need a second factor. That's what I say. It's the same as any authentication. And for me, it's just this type of authentication is on its own not enough.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks for that. That's very helpful. Thanks for your inputs. Richard, I saw your hand come up and go down. Is it up?
Yeah, I'll put it up this time. I'm hesitating a bit because I'm not totally sure I have a good understanding of the problem here. But it seems like the underlying problem you're trying to address here is a disconnect between what the user is authorizing and what the user believes himself to be authorizing. Okay, so I got a nod. So in that regard, it seems like things like MFA are kind of beside the point because that's just authenticating a user. Unless you could have some statements, something that encoded the user's intent, or somehow that where the authorization flow was constrained to say so that it would only work if the thing being authorized was what the user intended. But that it seems challenging to do much beyond what the mechanisms we already have. So yeah, I think that so I just wanted to kind of confirm that was the right problem to have in mind. Don't really have much in the way of solutions here, besides avoiding user interaction altogether. Now, Pieter, I think a moment ago you said you had some ideas about doing this without any interaction at all. Do you have concrete ideas in that direction?
I don't have concrete ideas on how to do it by avoiding user interaction at all. But the reason I bring it up is that even a feasible thing to do, right? I worry a lot about users and their ability to make sense of the things that we as technologists put in front of them. And it's best if you have to really simplify that, right? If I think, the value we got out of the little green padlock in the browser was immense. It was imperfect. Phishing still happened, but it minimized, say, the user education problem to make sure you see the padlock, right? And you really couldn't do much more than that, right? If you moused over the padlock, you could inspect the certificate and things like that. But apart from people on this call, I don't think there are many, out of the 11 billion people in the world, there's not a lot that that can make sense of that information. And so, you know, I sort of want to challenge maybe this audience and others. How do we simplify this experience? How do we simplify this ceremony, and how do we make it safe so that I can have confidence that when I see that QR code and I scan it, and we've been training people over the last 2 years about using their phones and you know, tap and go and scanning QR codes. What do we do to make that safe and secure, right? Maybe, you know, the gesture needs to be something that's more like when I use Google Pay, right, to pay for something at the supermarket. But that might mean a shift in how we think about hardware, right? You know, that NFC in every device. Well, that may take 10 years, but it's like TPMs, right? 15 years ago, the idea of a TPM in every PC was kind of not really something we had a dream and a vision for it. But it's not until Windows 11 came out that it became a mandatory part of the PC operating system, right? Or an expectation about the hardware that the operating system will run on. And so I also think there is the other way I would like us to think about this is also a multi-horizon problem. There is Horizon 1. There are things we could potentially do now. Maybe it's about user experience guidelines, right? Maybe there's implementation guidelines, threat models, right? Things like that. Maybe, and then there's potentially things on Horizon 2, right? Are there some secure profiles, right? That we can say, here is a, with CIBA, with device code flow, with SIOP, here is a secure profile, right? A set of things that you should do that would help or make it more secure. Maybe there's tweaks or changes to existing protocols. But then also on the Horizon 3 timeline, are there things that we should start thinking about and discussing now so that in 5 to 10 years time, we actually have a reasonable shot at it, right? Because the things we see around identity is just going to continue to grow as an important part, or as an important part of the ceremonies that our customers have in interacting with products, with services. And if customers lose trust, or they don't know how to trust these experiences, right, it becomes a handbrake on our ability to deliver value to them. So yeah, so I sort of want to invite folks really into this conversation, and yeah, just want to hear what's possible. I believe it's perhaps a very difficult problem, right? But I think if we don't do something about it, we're going to end up in the same place where the web was in the mid-90s, right? You couldn't know, you couldn't trust. There was no trust framework in place. That you just, you were just taking it's like, do you feel lucky, right? We want to take that away, or make that a more secure, more trusted, higher confidence experience.
So Justin wrote in the chat that it's, in his view, entirely possible that these kinds of approaches are inherently phishable by nature. And I think that might very well be possible. But then again, I mean, the same, or if you run everything in one browser, it's not phishable, at least not in that way. So the browser primitives really help us to secure a normal OAuth flow, because we have sessions attached to the specific interaction and so on. So I'm wondering, and maybe in an ideal world, so in a theoretical world, we might have the device presenting the code and the device consuming the code somehow magically working together and figuring out whether the user sees what they actually want to, or where they actually want to log in. So maybe we can make use of browser primitives to at least provide a little bit more protection than what we have today. And to this end, Christina Bauer contacted me. She has an approach from her research on web security. Christina, you're also in the call. Do you want to present your approach?
Yes, I can do that. I think it's better if I'm also sharing the flow. So if you would pass me the screen.
All yours, Christina.
Okay. Well, it's just a quick sketch so far, so it's a bit overloaded. Let's see if I can make that a bit more. Can you read that now?
Yes, I can.
So, well, the core issue that I saw, what I have thought about is the SIOP cross-device flow specifically. And well, the core issue there is, as Daniel presented before, that the RP mixes up the session and the user, or the RP and the user disagree about the sessions everything is about. So the user just assumes it's a session on their other device, on the authentication device SIOP, and the relying party thinks they have a session with the attacker. So the rough idea is to move a part of the SIOP to the first device. The first idea was to have it as a native app or the likes as the SIOP, but Daniel then pointed out, which sounds like it would work, that you could also use a web service for this, because it's not actually that it's on the user's device. Rather, we need to implicate the browser to agree about which session we are talking. And the core idea is to associate the flow with a to explicitly pass the session the flow is about in another nonce, which I here called xDeviceRef, but I'm not good at making up names, so that's really discussable. And well, we have at the beginning here just normally the relying party and the browser, or the user through the browser, starting a cross-device flow for the session, which then is rendered by the stub instead directly in the browser. Or well, if it's a web service, it's in the browser again, but by the stub. But instead of directly passing it to the op, we go back via the browser, via redirect to the RP, and make sure that here the session that this up here was about is passed again to the RP. So the relying party can check if the session is known and if the request was sent for that session, in fact. And then it can create that xDevice referent and pass it back to the stub, which then renders the QR code for the self-issued op, and the flow continues with that xDeviceRef passed again here back, so that the relying party can retrieve the session for the xDeviceRef in the end and do validation. And well, that kind of moved the phishing, if just done like that, from the self-issued, between the self-issue and the stub. So we additionally need a notion of trust between stub and the self-issued op. So the stub needs to present something like a signature or the likes with that QR code to the self-issued op to verify that it, or to attest that it has done this test with due diligence. So I think that's why the web service approach is interesting, because it could be provided by the implementers of the self-issued op, and then has a public key that is already configured in the self-issued op. But there might be other options for that. So that was roughly the idea I've come up with.
Thanks. So I like the idea of essentially moving parts into the original browser on device 1, which could mean that the user device 2 becomes kind of a second factor for the OpenID transaction. It's certainly not applicable to all use cases, so I don't see the terminal use case here. But it might be interesting to keep this model in mind when we think about solutions, because when you have the stub on the user device 1, then it can use all the browser features to figure out if everything is working correctly.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, that I think definitely a useful. Thanks for presenting this, and thanks for sharing your idea. This is definitely one of the things we should keep in mind as we explore different options for sure. I'm curious about the kiosk scenario. I'm also wondering, maybe one of the things we need to do is write down the maybe be explicit. I don't know, Daniel, maybe this already has been done, but all the different use cases might be helpful as we think about potential solutions, right? Some scenarios may just be very, very hard to protect against, like kiosks, things like that. But maybe there are, cases where the device is under the control of the user, or it is, I'm using a personal PC and I'm using my phone to authenticate something by scanning a QR code in the browser. It might offer us there might be different mitigations, right? It's maybe not ideal. Maybe we can't solve it in one fell swoop, but maybe there are different variations of this that we can solve.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I see, Richard, I think your point is yeah, I think we probably also just need to do a thorough write-up of the attack as we see it. Right?
Well, Christina presented the ladder diagram yesterday in a session. Maybe she can quickly show it if possible, because that was quite clear.
Christina, can you share?
Yes, or Petram, do you have the slides here right now? Otherwise, I can quickly look if I can find them.
I think it's better if you look. I'm not sure if I have them right now. So you mean for this SIOP attack, right?
Yeah, I think in the first couple of slides you had, Zaid.
Yeah, I can see if I can quickly find that.
Well, the one version, not so nice as the one yesterday, I have in my notes, but I think it contains all the relevant components as well. Move in a bit again. So this is, again, a sketch of the attack. That I try to address in this particular set of node or idea. I can find the nicer version I had in the slides.
Is this helping looking at that, or
helping It's helping a bit. I don't have a ton of SIOP background, so I may be missing a couple things. Actually, Peter, I was going to ask you whether this is corresponding to the case that you started off this session with.
Yeah, pretty much. I think this is, yes, I think this is a good representation.
If it helps, we can also go through the step by step. I think we have enough time for that. Because obviously a clear understanding of the attack is helpful in the discussion.
So Christina, do you want to talk us through it?
Yes, I can do that. So pretty much the attack starts with a normal start of a login flow. The attacker says to the relying party, I want to log in with using the X device flow, the cross device flow. And I forgot in this that here the relying party somehow passes in a QR code to the attacker. Okay, anyway, the attacker gets the QR code to authenticate from the relying party, and then somehow has to present it to the user. For example, he disguises as the RP. He says or he says, or he acts as another RP and just say, hey, want to log in, or says, yes, scan this QR code, it's amazing. And somehow the user scans the QR code, the self-issued op is called, and the user sees, okay, he is authenticating towards the relying party, and either the user is careless and doesn't check that, or he says, well, the relying party is something I trust, doesn't sound strange to me, and he posts, they post the response or authenticate, authorize the SIOP to post the response to the relying party for some identity towards the relying party. And the relying party then from that post somehow gets back to the session as one, validates everything, and then gets back to the attacker and says, okay, you're authenticated now as Alice, which I here called the end user, or the identity of the end user rather.
Richard, any questions on that?
Yeah, I think that sort of hangs together, and it's roughly as I was imagining it. It was, I think my confusion here is that the notions of relying party here seem a bit different from the usual usage in the OAuth context. I think it's probably what's tripping me up. I mean, here the relying party seems like a resource server, in that the attacker is getting access to things on the resource server that they ought not have. But I think it's gradually, the mappings are becoming clear.
The resource itself would be in SIOP, but I think with authentication, if the attacker refreshes their browser, attacker can sign in as a victim, would be the problem. And with SIOP, we're also would be transferring claims about the end user, attributes about the end user. So those might be passed to the attacker too.
Thanks, Christina. Damien, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's the way we were solving this, or thinking about solving this as well, is that the whole problem happens that in the presentation of the QR code in the browser, I'm actually using the client browser from the attacker and not the client browser from the real browser of the proper origin. So the way to solve it is that if you use the client origin from the attacker's browser, the browser presenting the code, then you send that back to the device, and then you sign it in the user agent, and you send it back to the SIOP. Then it can validate that the origin matches your origin, and you cannot do this type of attack then, but you have to use the client browser origin then as part of the QR code being presented. that's roughly how the feeder 2 works as well, but you can also do it here, because if I don't allow an origin other than my origin in the client browser, it's not possible then to present the QR code then, which will be used on attacker website and my website. So you prevent this type of phishing attack. Just one of the main type of phishing attacks. So you could reduce massively the amount of attack surface then if you include the origin as part of the QR code being presented, sign it and send it back to the server thereafter using your private key from your agent. Does that make sense, sir?
How would the scanning device check that?
You'd have to use a WebAuthn type protocol from the browsers.
Well, I was thinking about that as well. I think you would need a little bit of innovation there, like some new technology. So for example, if the QR code were being displayed in a browser context, you could have the browser display some other thing that a QR code scanner camera could recognize as the origin, right? So the camera wouldn't just scan the QR code, it would see the QR code and something else in its field of view. And the something else would provide the origin, authenticated from the browser, not the content. Obviously, I don't really understand the problem well enough to say for sure that this is a solution, but it feels like that's a domain that's worth this idea of origin binding seems like something that's worth exploring. And it seems like there might be some way you could kind of enlist the the QR scanning facility here, whether it's a camera or a browser or whatever, scanning for the QR code and have the thing that's displaying the QR code display a little information that is then extra information besides the QR code that is then picked up by the reader. I think feels like there may be something there in that domain.
What's good is that every agent has its own private public key, and then you can sign it then the origin with your key, and you can use a nonce as well on top of it for X protection, but then you can send that back to the SIOP server, and then you have the problem solved. So that the only real problem you have to solve is how to get this origin into the code. But it has to come from the client browser, so you have to implement some type of JavaScript or WebAuthn type protocol for that.
And anything that you display on the RP browser would also need to be protected against replay by the attacker.
Yeah, exactly.
Or anything, and that could be really hard if it's just some visual.
Well, see, if you start the initial request, which you always do from the server, it can then sign it as well and send it off, and that does the whole round trip as well.
Yeah, but then the attacker could still replay it, and the user doesn't.
Let me see. Yeah, no, I see the replay risk here, but I wonder if there is some intent about how the relying party intends the QR code to be displayed that could be encoded and read back here. So, for example, if the relying party could say that this QR code should only be scanned from a browser that is displaying it from this origin. And then, if you had a scanner app that was trusted by the relying party, and the scanner app could say, I scan this QR code from this context, from a browser showing this origin, or from a bus stop. If the scanner app could somehow return that in the response to the relying party, then the relying party could match that up and say, I intended this URL to be consumed in this way, but it was actually consumed in another way.
I agree that would solve the problem. I'm not sure if that's achievable.
This will still send the user in the position to confirm it. And I don't think we can trust in the user to really understand what's going on here.
Well, but maybe you can provide some extra information with that, right? It's like the padlock, right? I think there's some analogy for me there that I think to Justin's earlier point in the chat, right? It would be great if we could 100% mitigate this, but if we can mitigate it 99% or 99.9%, right? If we can, if there's sort of a visual cue, if there's some extension like that, that helps reduce the number of times this attack can succeed, that's already a step closer. Some other ideas that we've sort of brainstormed and played with is ideas of like, can you look, or can you encode the geolocation, right, where you think this QR code should be displayed, and if you're scanning that, if you're not within a kilometer, 100 meters, or at least in the same country, right, at least warn the user that they're consuming this device or they're consuming this QR code in a physical location where it wasn't intended to be displayed. Now, again, that'll not work for all. That'll not work for all scenarios, but even just ways in which we can help the end user make a better decision might be. So I like that idea, Damien. Thanks. And Richard, I think just pulling the thread on those ideas could could lead us to a place where we maybe in the near term have some where we have some opportunity to make things better while we work on the long term as well. So we're coming up to time, a few minutes left. I'm curious if there was any other thoughts that folks had or wanted to share before we talk a little bit about what we might, how do we proceed from here?
So there were a couple of questions on the chat, especially also regarding Christina's approach. But I fear that the time is not enough to clear all of them up right now. So maybe it's better if we talk about how to continue the discussion.
So, at first, I think if, in terms of continuing the discussion, I'm curious about what's a good forum, right? What's a good, where do we have the conversation, and also, I think we want to make it accessible and visible to everybody who has an interest. I'm curious, Daniel, do you have any thoughts on a good way for us to progress? Christina, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. I think a high-level question is, we started by kind of equating doing an OAuth device grant and cross-device SIOP, but in the second half, we kind of ended up discussing mitigations for cross-device SIOPs that might not necessarily work for OAuth device grant flow. So, do we want these two kind of flows problems, and I guess CIBA has a similar problem too, but be discussed in one forum, or because on the SIOP side, we do have issues discussing this. We do have a Word document with, that Daniel had put together, outlining potential mitigations. So what do we want this to be in one forum altogether or not, is I think what I want to see answered.
My sense is that it is the same problem, right? I think with SIOP, there's a strong emphasis on the QR code, but with device code flow, right, that code can be represented as can be similarly represented. So I think it is, if it helps us to focus, we can focus on one of these, but I think we do have to address it in multiple places. I think the first thing that I'm looking for is, where is a good place and where are people interested? And can they give energy to this problem? And I think then we can figure out a mechanism to make that available for all the different flows. We do have this problem already with device code flow out there in the wild. I think with SIOP, it's perhaps more preemptive, right? We know we're going to have this problem, so we're trying to get ahead of it. But we also have existing problems to address. Richard.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like there's, you could maybe consider this in two halves. Like, one half is, how do we make QR codes less replayable? And there's some innovative discussions we've talked about that in that case, like Damien raised with some signing stuff. The other half is, how do we refactor the protocol so that the protocol doesn't care about replay? So I think, and that's more kind of protocol engineering, and that's going to be more amenable to standards. If I don't think that the context-bound QR code work is probably amenable to standard speech because there's so many trust assumptions that are going to get baked into that. It's going to be more, like you said, a kind of a TPM sort of evolution of the ecosystem. So I think I would kind of have that conceptual split. I don't really have the depth here to understand what might be workable in terms of making the protocol immune to replay. But it seems like at least we have some ideas on the reducing the possibility of replay side of things.
Okay. So I think in general, we want to try and avoid boiling the ocean, right? So I think that's, and I see, Vittorio, your comment as well, right? There's different device code flows deployed, and maybe we end up being waylaid, right, by mixing it up with SIOP. So one option for us is to take that in, back to the different, to OAuth, to OpenID Connect, right, and we go from there. But I do think we want to somehow make sure that we don't lose the lessons, right, because the pattern seems to be similar. So it sounds, Christina, like there's already a mechanism for us, at least in the SIOP world, with OpenID Connect, where we can that we should just. I think that I'm hearing you say that's one mechanism that exists, so we don't necessarily need to create a new one.
Sorry, was that a question for me?
Yep.
So
I think you're suggesting that we take this conversation so I think two things. One, to help make to prevent us confusing different things, let's keep the conversation, let's split the conversation up, right? So there's, to Richard's point, some of it's around thinking about how we prevent QR code replay, and maybe said those are more relevant to the SIOP discussion, right? So we maybe sort of focus on that, and then that's a separate discussion that we have to have around device code flow in a different forum potentially.
Yeah, we can keep working in our groups, but then having a forum like this is super helpful. So I think the question is, what is our next opportunity to come together and share, the progress we've made?
When's the next IIW, for example? Is that a good place for us to come and share? Okay,
Not sure I'll see all these amazing experts on this call in IIW.
Okay, so I think here's maybe what I would suggest for folks who are interested in this problem. What I'd ask for you is to at least please get in touch with Daniel and myself. I think we have some work to figure out exactly how we want to progress this, and leveraging the work that's already ongoing would be good. Vittorio, you've come on the camera.
Yeah, I'd like to make a little comment, and I couldn't find where to raise my hand, so I just use a different affordance. I think that the considerations that you brought up for the device flow are valid, but the device flow is something which is out there, which is being recommended. So if this is an attack that we believe is common, if we have concrete examples and similar, I think that we shouldn't wait for IIW, and this shouldn't be a nice to have, and this should not be tied to something experimental as SIOP, because I use the device flow pretty much every day with multiple devices, and the number is increasing. So if this is, we are going toward a cliff in which this will be widespread, and the attacks will also widespread, I think the ITF needs a thread on the mailing list. The attack needs to be described in details, and the ITF needs to decide whether that's a recall level thing, or if it's instead something that warrants updating the BCP for native clients, or I don't know. But something needs to be done, because this stuff is out in production, and we recommend people to use it. So I think that just waiting isn't an option here.
Okay. Yeah,
I think that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
And that said,
Thanks, Vittorio. So again, I'd say for folks who are interested in this problem, please get in touch with Daniel and myself. I think Vittorio's point, right, sounds like we need to get a thread started about device code flow, and then at least have the conversation there. And then I think for SIOP, we have a forum for that. And let's just make sure that the conversations stay connected.
Thanks.